This report we're going to discuss is, you'll have an advanced copy of it at the end of the conversation. It's actually, will give you a taste of my forthcoming book titled Rising Turkey, 21st Century's First Muslim Power, in which I look at the new Turkey that has emerged after 11 years of single-party rule in Turkey by the Justice and Development Party, AKP, that new country's dynamics, and also what it means for U.S. policy. What I'll do briefly now is to look at some of the key findings of this report, which you'll also be able to read in the forthcoming book, and then draw some policy suggestions relevant to U.S. for what that means for us here in Washington and the new Turkey and what kind of a country it has become. Let me make some brief policy brushstrokes on what this country looks like after 11 years of rule by the AKP. And first of all, what does 11 years of rule by a single party in Turkey mean? It means a lot. Turkey is a country whose political system was marked by so many decades by coalition governments, which typically lasted 2 to 3 years. And this is a government that is now finished, it's halfway through its third term. It's destined to win the next elections of 2014, so its term is quite long. Therefore, in terms of Turkish politics, if you think that governments typically last 2 years and this government has already done 11 years, it will be the equivalent of a party here doing 4 consecutive terms in terms of American politics. So you get the sense of the longevity of AKP rule in Turkey. That means the ability of this party to transform Turkey, therefore, has been dramatic. So I'm going to start with that, look at domestic politics, economy and foreign policy, and then go into conclusions. Politically, obviously, I think Turkey has moved to what I would call a post-Kemalist phase. The country's political system has been transformed after a long period of transition and also marked by some political conflict in the first part of the last decade. What do I mean by post-Kemalist? I think two elements that mark Kemalism are largely gone. I wouldn't say they have disappeared, but are largely recalibrated in Turkey. One is the relationship between state and religion. Turkey's practice of European style of secularism, also known as laïcité, is largely gone. Laïcité mandated firewalls between religion on the one hand, education, politics, and government on the other. That's not the case. There is now religion in education, politics, and government in Turkey. And I would say in that regard, Turkey's model of laïcité has largely disappeared. A second element, I think, where Turkey has moved to the post-Kemalist phase is in terms of how the country's elites and most Turks saw their identity in global politics. Under Kemalism, Turkey was a country where the Turks saw themselves as Europeans who were accidentally placed next to the Middle East. That's also gone. Now Turks see themselves as part of the Middle East, though they also continue to see themselves as European at the same time, obviously. But I think that perception that Turkey somehow was misplaced next to the Middle East is entirely disappeared. I was thinking of a way to better encapsulate this argument. If Turkey was a Latin American country, its earlier position in that continent would have been compared to Argentina's position in Latin America, a country that kind of is there but does not see itself as belonging there. That was the old Turkey. The new Turkey is the Brazil of Latin America. It's a country that sees itself as part of that region, is the most dominant power economically, has built significant political power, but yet lacks that hard power to match the soft power to become a true regional power. And I think that transition from Argentina to Brazil, which stops there, is a telltale sign of Turkey's new perception of how it fits into the Middle East. It is the largest country economically in the region. It sees itself as a dominant power, and it wants to shape the region, but lacks some of the hard power elements to do that yet, and I'll come to it in a minute. Socially, the new Turkey, as a result of transition, is a country that has not yet settled down. I would say it still is looking for peace. It's very split. One of the best ways you can sell an op-ed to any publication in the U.S. is title it "Split Turkey," and editors will read it because this is a country that's truly descriptive. These two words are truly descriptive of Turkey's current nature. How is it split? It's split between the supporters of the governing party and its opponents. The governing party, AKP, received about 50% of the vote in the last elections. That means another half of the country did not vote for it. That split might be, not as 50-50 now, perhaps, because if you add the conservative and other nationalist votes that went to other parties, I would say you still see a secularist divide in Turkey that's about a third of the country's population. It's a very large bloc. But there are other splits between Kurdish nationalists and Turks who oppose any political rights for Kurdish nationalists, sectarian splits which could be accentuated as a result of the Syria conflict and other issues as well. At the same time, there's good news from Turkey. Economically, this has been what I would call a miraculous decade. I would call it the Turkish miracle. It's in the same sense that many European countries took off in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. After a decade of constant and continuous growth, this is what Turkey had in the last decade. Its economy has grown at a record-breaking pace of 5.3% annually. Turkey, as a result, is now wealthier than it has ever been in many centuries. Income per capita has tripled in the last decade. This is while the world around Turkey melts down economically and politically. So it's not only getting better, but in relative terms, it's also getting better. So that doubles the effect on Turkish citizens of how they feel compared to the rest of the world. Income per capita is now at about $18,000. That means Turkey is catching up for the first time with a lot of its European neighbors. And just to give you a sense of what that means, again, in the Turkish mind, a lot of this will relate to the debate on Turkey's EU accession and why this is becoming less of a key concern for Turks and Turkish policymakers. A decade ago, average Turkish incomes were about 30% of average European incomes in 2002. Now, 10 years later, 11 years later, average Turkish incomes are about two-thirds of average European incomes. The catching up is fast, and I think Turkey's progress of economic growth, if that continues, and given where European economies are, it's not far-fetched to assume that before the end of this decade, average Turkish incomes will match and surpass average European incomes, and Turkish incomes already matching many single European countries' incomes at the moment. The economic growth obviously has been driven by two factors. One is diversification of trade. This started when Turkish companies went out beyond Turkey's traditional trading partners in Europe, looked for markets elsewhere, and they benefited from the growth of emerging markets. They have also gone to markets that others did not go, including Africa, and even as far as traditional places where Turks did not have outreach, Latin America, that has been matched by an outreach by Turkey's foreign ministry that has opened up missions in all these countries where Turks are trading. And as a result, I think Turkey has not been as adversely affected by the economic downturn of its European partners as it would have been had its trade remained single-handedly focused on Europe, which was the case for so many decades. This miraculous growth, I think, has also been driven by another factor, which is stability. Again, unusual in Turkish context. As I said earlier, 10 years of single-party rule by one government. It would be, in dog years in American politics, that'd be more than 15, 20 years. But at the same time, the fact that this is a country that has kept itself outside of regional conflicts, this is where Syria comes in. I'll come to that in the policy conclusions. All of that, I think, has brought the AKP government 3 electoral victories, and it will deliver it one more victory if that economic growth pattern continues, which means Turkey has to remain stable, both internally, but also be able to minimize the impact of the Syria war if this pattern has to continue. What else has changed in Turkey? Political change, societal change, economic change. Finally, Turkey has learned to build soft power, and that, I think, is another aspect of these fascinating stories of growth of Turkish businesses. They now have internationally recognized, a significant number of internationally recognized businesses, one of which is Turkish Airlines. If you're flying anywhere in Turkey's neighborhood, you'll probably transit through Istanbul Airport because they have the best deals, and they're voted the best airline in Europe in the last 2 years, and they serve you Turkish food, not bad. At the same time, I think this is a country that has built soft power through its schools run by the Gülen community, its institutions. The foreign ministry, as I said, has now opened up missions in places that Turks had never heard of until 10 years ago. But now this is a country that's building power. But where the soft power comes short, and this is where I go back to my Brazil argument earlier, is although Turkey has built soft power, it's doing really well economically. I don't think it yet has the hard power to match its soft power ambitions to become a regional player, regional power in the Middle East. And I owe this analogy to my friend, Ambassador Jeffrey. Turkey looks like Japan, therefore. It has a huge amount of money, lots of economic power, has globally reaching institutions, but it still needs the security framework of an international organization and a strong ally, and that is where NATO and the United States comes in. So in the same way Japan needs the U.S. as an ally in terms of East Asia security, Turkey has found out, I think, with the latest developments, that it can stand on its own in this region, and hence its foreign policy pivot. Which brings me to my last point, Turkey's foreign policy. In the last 10 years, the pivot that we have talked about often in the last 2 years is largely driven by this perception that Turkey is economically powerful, it is big, it is growing, but it cannot do the Middle East on its own. And I think the Arab Spring has exposed that shortcoming in the sense that first Turkey wanted to kind of play out on its own. This started in Libya, then they realized that it wasn't that easy. work with the U.S. Pretty soon afterwards. And I think the Syria crisis, the fact that there could be civil war, and now there is civil war, across Turkey's longest land border, with possible sectarian and ethnic ramifications inside Turkey, was a disaster scenario that the Turks wanted to avoid. And who did they go for? Run for NATO and run for the United States. Second, that this war next door, civil war, or the way it spills into Turkey, could damage Turkey's hard cash, its stability, is another, I think, factor that pushed Turkey's pivot towards the United States in foreign policy, because Turkey's growth, the AKP's electoral victory, Erdogan wants to be elected as the country's next president in 2014. He has nationwide local elections coming up 2013 this year, and presidential elections is also scheduled for the next year. All of that, I think, hinges on continued economic growth. Turkey is now a large middle class that goes beyond the confines of traditional middle class strongholds like Istanbul. This is a country in which a lot of people now have mortgages for the first time in their lives. All of that is based on economic stability. If that collapsed, I think that would be the end of electoral run for the AKP government, and all of that hinges on continued stability. That means minimizing the impact of Syria, the civil war in Syria, and that also suggests, ruling out unilateral Turkish action against Syria. I think this was discussed for a long time. Turkey was suggesting that if the number of refugees on its territory surpassed 100,000, it would take action on its own. There are now 200,000 refugees in Turkey. They're not doing anything on their own, obviously realizing that this is not so easy to push. So I think the Arab Spring, the need to maintain stability for both domestic and regional reasons has pushed Turkey much closer to the United States and will continue to do so. Competition against Iran is a soft factor in the sense that it's not tangible as Syria is, but I think it also drives some of the pivot back to the United States. And the way I like to see this is whenever I go to Ankara and meet with policymakers, I say, so what's your problem with Iraq? Turkey and Iraqi relations are very rocky right now. That rhymed. In the sense that if you think Turkish-Syrian, Turkish-Iranian relations are problematic, you should study Turkish-Iraqi ties. That's really where you have significant problems. And so I ask policymakers, I say, what's your problem with Iraq? Is it because they're Shiites? They say, of course not. We don't have sectarian vision of the world. So, and then I go back to the conversation. I say, so what's your problem with Iraq? Is it that this country is not getting along with Turkey? They say, no. The government in Baghdad is dominated by Iranians. I think that is the perception that is driving a lot of the Turkish view of the region, and that will shape the pivot further. Let me now move on to my policy suggestions after having given you a synopsis of this new Turkey from societal change to the foreign policy arena. Turkey wants to be a regional power, and as it sees itself, and it wants to be treated as a regional power by its Western partners. What does it have to do to get there, and what should our policy be on Turkey in that regard, with suggestions for implications for the forthcoming administration. To rise as a regional power and potentially as a global power, and Turkey has a lot going for itself, but I think they've covered, there's potential for them to make it to that path. First of all, I think, first conclusion, all roads domestically lead to Turkey's new constitution. Every policy suggestion I will make, I'm going to say, oh, it's the new constitution again. Here's how it goes. First, Turkey has to, what I call, release its creative energy instead of, this constant infighting between the various factions across the many fault lines of its society. And, the fault lines in Turkey are many. They go from pro-AKP to anti-AKP, which is a very deep one, and less deep ones such as secularist and Islamist, with smaller constituencies, Kurdish nationalists and Turkish nationalists, Alevis and Sunnis, Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And these fault lines are many. Some are more acute than the others. Some are more violent than the others. But they are nevertheless fault lines, I think, that sap Turkey's creative energy. If this is a country that has to become a regional power, it can't do that if it's constantly fighting among its various constituencies and it's inward looking and it's consuming its otherwise creative energy. And that, I think, requires a country that creates that writes a new constitution. There's now a debate over this new charter, and that constitution has to provide room for everyone. All these constituencies that fall across these various fault lines that I've highlighted. Now, this is not wishful thinking. It's not me saying, oh, I wish this is how Turkey would turn. This is realistic. It has to happen because almost all these constituencies I went through are so large that none of them will disappear. And therefore, the new constitution has to accommodate them because they're not going to go away. Obviously, you have a very large group of people who support the governing party and will vote for it, and a very large group who will never vote for it. That's probably about 25, 30 million people, 35% of the electorate. That's the population of a middle-sized European country. Those people are not going to disappear, and they have to be accommodated. At the same time, the various other divides across from the Kurdish nationalist opinion, when you get the advanced copy of the study, you're going to see a map, for example, which makes a case that although Kurds are now spread all over Turkey, and there are probably more Kurds who live in Western metropolitan Turkey, that's not where you see the strength of the Kurdish Nationalist Party. The strength is confined to the what I call far southeast, east and south of Diyarbakir. Again, not the entire southeast, not the entire east, a very kind of a regionalized problem now. But even regionalized, even minuscule, that problem is not going to disappear, especially because it has a violent component. A spike in PKK violence in the last year has led Turkey to reconsider its earlier position. Now there are talks, which we can go back to in the Q&A. And I think the fact that there were more casualties as a result of PKK violence in the last year than there has been for over a decade is another call sign for Turkey to address its many fault lines and domestic problems, not the most important of which I think is the Kurdish issue. To rise as a regional power, Turkey not only has to address its fault lines, and the new charter is the best way to do that, but also has to continue to grow economically. It's not done yet. The economic growth has to come forward. In more robust terms, Turkey needs to maintain at least 5% growth in the last decade if it wants to become one of the top 10 economies of the world. And it could get there. It's now a G20 power, but it could become one of the top 10 powers, surpassing Italy and even Spain before that, if it continues to grow at least 5%. To do that, obviously, once again, Turkey has to address the spike in PKK violence, which saps huge amounts of resources from the country, as well as inflicting casualties. Again, I think the road there leads to the new constitution. And finally, Turkey has to minimize the impact of the Syria conflict. It cannot spill over across Turkey's borders, and Turkey cannot become an active side to this conflict without NATO or U.S. support, because that will be the end of Turkish economic miracle. The moment this is seen as yet another country that's unstable, fighting for whatever reason it is, this is the end of Turkey's miraculous economic growth. This is the end of everybody putting their money in the Istanbul stock market. And this is also the end of electoral wins for the governing party. And that's where I think the whole Syria question comes in. Turkey has realized, as a result of the Syria uprising and the fact that this has turned into a civil war, that maybe it does not have as much hard power as it thought. And this is, I think, explains both Turkey's decision to join missile defense and also work closer with NATO and ask for deployment of Patriot missiles, NATO missiles on Turkish territory. But at the same time, I think it has realized that this is a country that if it truly wants to become a regional power, and it can only do so if it leverages, for its own sake, but also for the sake of its regional ambitions, if it leverages what I call its Western overlay. If the Turks go to Saudis and say, we're concerned about Iranian nuclear threat, let's do something about it, the Saudis will take it one way if this is a Turkey that's not serious about NATO, because then Turkey looks like a wealthy Yemen, and Yemen is not wealthy, so it's a large Muslim country that comes and says, let's do something together. What do you bring to the table? Not much. But if Turkey goes to the Saudis and says, we're concerned about Iranian nukes, and if it's a serious, committed member of NATO, then it looks really good. It looks like a strong Turkey. And I think that's the non-tangible element of the country's pivot that has been driven by the Arab Spring, that is further driven by Syria. The more they need to minimize the impact of the Syrian conflict and make sure that Assad goes as soon as possible, because they cannot afford to have a civil war next door. It makes them look unstable, potentially unstable. The more they're going to turn to the U.S. and to NATO for working together, and I think that will only drive Turkey's pivot further to us. Policy suggestions for us, for policymakers in Washington. Good news is that for about a decade, a lot of the debates on Turkey ended here, because we would look at it, we would say, what do you do? It looks like we need the Turks more than they need us, so just, go with it. It looks right now that maybe Turkey needs the U.S. more than the U.S. needs Turkey. Maybe we need each other both on comparable levels for the first time, for a change. And that's primarily because Turkey's desire to have stronger military, strategic security cooperation with U.S. and NATO now trumps its other regional ambitions. And I think that is an important element of leverage for U.S. policymakers, but there are many others. One is the fact that Turkey wants to become a regional power. How do you become a regional power? You have to become someone who can talk to all sides I'll take two areas where I would suggest that this has not necessarily been happening. Syria. Turkey has been an active supporter of the opposition, but it has been able to build good, long-lasting, and confidence-based ties with not all elements of the Syrian opposition or the Syrian population for that purpose. The Christians in Syria, for example, are largely distrusting of Turkey. The Kurds are not on board yet. You're seeing stronger ties between the Muslim Brotherhood elements and Ankara, but that does not reflect itself across the Syrian opposition. If Turkey wants to become a key player in post-Assad Syrian politics, it needs to have ties with everybody in the game. And I think that's the idea that I was trying to portray earlier, that if Turkey wants to be a regional power, it has to be on talking terms with everybody. The Syrian conflict is a case in point. Ties with Israel is another one. I think if you look at this, if Turkey wants to become a regional power, it has to be listened to in all capitals, and that includes the Israeli capital as well, and that's not the case. And it was not ironic, therefore, that a couple of months ago, the Turkish foreign minister leaked to the press that Turkey was having secret talks with the Israelis for normalization. This came right after the Egyptians brokered a ceasefire between Hamas and the Israelis, and the Turks said, well, we should be doing that because we're the regional power. So they basically wanted to say, we're still in the game. We're talking to the Israelis, we want to normalize. And I think that will be an element, tangible element of Turkey's desire to become a regional power once Turkish-Israeli ties are normalized. Last but not least, for Turkish domestic politics, suggestions for the U.S. side, there's not much we can do. This is Turkey's internal business. But there is an overlap between U.S. policy on the ideal U.S. policy on Turkey's domestic politics and U.S. policy on the region in general. And that overlap, again, is, as I said earlier, old roads lead to the new constitution. If Turkey wants to be a regional power as it sees itself and treated as such by its Western allies, it cannot become one if it does not write a liberal constitution which guarantees freedoms and broad liberties for everybody. And I think that's the only way Turkey can go out there and portray itself and say, you know, obviously a country that should be treated as a partner in the post-Arab Spring Middle East. What that means is a constitution that, you know, fully addresses some of these problems that I highlighted in the beginning of my presentation. I'll take a couple. You know, we talked about the collapse of the laïcité model. What does that mean for the new Turkey? I think the new constitution, for example, has to provide for two things. Freedom of religion and freedom from religion at the same time, to address this idea of the split camps that cannot get to live together but have to learn to live together. And I think that will be a sure, safe way of making everybody welcome in this new Turkey. At the same time, I think this should be a constitution that has to take a more liberal and lenient attitude on Turkey's Christian and Jewish communities. As I said earlier, when I went through the fault lines, I said, some of these fault lines are real in the sense that the constituencies that fall across the fault lines are very big. They won't disappear. This applies to all of these fault lines with the exception of the Muslim, Jewish, Christian fault lines. There are so few Jews and Christians in Turkey that you could write a constitution and ignore all of that and say that numerically speaking, the Jewish and Christian communities are not big enough a fault line for the Turkish government to consider writing a constitution, for example, that is religion blind. And I think that's what Turkey needs to do, to come up with a charter that is entirely religion blind, because that's what makes Turkey a liberal democracy. It's not protecting the large, significant groups. It's protecting the smallest groups. That makes, I think, a country a true liberal democracy. And I think that's where the significance of this idea of writing a new constitution that becomes religion blind and guarantees group protections for Jews and Christians, as well as rights, would be significant. Last point, Turkish model. I know this question will come. I did a piece on this with my colleague Dave Pollack. I think he's in the room. We tried to sell it to a publication about a year ago. Back then, people were not interested. They said the Turkish model is not going to apply, but we actually said it's not going to apply. And then we came back to the piece and we just published it somewhere else. What Turkey has experienced in the last 10 years, can this be taken over and replicated, let's say, in post-Arab Spring countries? The answer is no. One, a lot of Turkey's transformation has been driven by economic growth, phenomenal growth as it is, but that growth depended on two things. One, it depended on single-party rule by a dominant party in this political system. That's not very good news because that kind of suggests that you can't really have, you know, the idea of a change of governments and as Turkey typically used to have to produce stability. I think the lesson of the Turkish political system, not a very good one, is that Turkey produces political stability when it has a dominant party that's in charge. But the other lesson of Turkey, or the unlesson of Turkey, is that Turkey's growth and economic transformation and everything it has achieved in the last 10 years happened within the background of phenomenal global economic growth, which Turkey benefited from. That's not the case in the region anymore. So I think the idea that you will have the Muslim Brotherhood produce dramatic economic growth in Turkey and therefore consolidate power based on that and win further victories and therefore follow the Turkish model, I can't see that quite happening. I'm going to end up over here and turn the microphone to my colleagues. And thanks so much for your attention, obviously. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Soner. Ambassador Wilson.
Is it best if I stay?
Yes, if you could, please.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here at the Washington Institute. Soner has given a very broad and comprehensive perspective on a number of issues that affect Turkey today and affect U.S.-Turkish relations. And I just want to home in on, confine my comments to three baskets of issues. First, to sort of add some additional thoughts about this issue of Turkey rising or Turkey's transformation. Second, talk a little bit about U.S.-Turkish relations. And then third, some comments on the way forward. I think Soner's done a good job of capturing this idea of Turkey rising, of Turkey that has profoundly transformed itself. And kind of a couple of pieces that I like to use to describe this. On the economic side, in the course of a generation, Turkey has gone from being a $70 billion economy to a $700 billion economy. That's a huge change for a country of this sort. It's a huge change for any country, just literally in the space of 20, 25, or 30 years. That economic transformation has its roots, I would submit, in the policy decisions that were made under President Özal in the 1980s to open up the Turkish economy to outside competition, and then later in the 1990s to establish a customs union agreement with the European Union, and the government stability that Soner has referred to, I think, was an additional big driver. This economic development has likewise transformed the country demographically or socially. 30 years ago, 3/4 of Turkey's citizens lived in the rural parts of the country, 25% of the cities. Those percentages are exactly reversed. Again, in the space of a generation, think of how long this kind of transition has taken elsewhere in the world, in the United States. Think about what were the implications of that, and then apply some of that to Turkey. Some specific effects. In some ways, although I accept what Soner said about the Kurdish issue as one that still has important roots in the southeast, the Kurdish issue has become nationalized. The biggest Kurdish city in the world is Istanbul, and large Kurdish populations in Ankara and Mersin and Antalya and Izmir, maybe not uniformly around the country, but the issue has become nationalized in some ways that it was not in the 1990s, and therefore it's dealt with in some ways that were not in the 1990s. Any kind of economic and social transformation of this sort is going to have acute political consequences, and so it is in Turkey. The political party that has successfully figured out how to make use of this economic and this social transformation of the country would be the AKP. The other parties have not adapted their message, they've not adapted their strategies, they've not found ways to make themselves as competitive, anywhere near as competitive politically as the AKP. And I think that too is a prism through which one, I think, has to understand the Justice and Development Party's success. It's important to note too that these transformations do have their limits, and one shouldn't go too far. Unemployment, in spite of this spectacular economic growth, basically is at the same level as it was when the AK Party took power in 2001, and it's at a level consistent with those throughout much of the 1980s and 90s. Government has not really been able to solve that problem, even though its strategies have led to impressive job creation. Turkey is in dire need of educational reform. The education system has done a good job of providing the workers and the engines for the current Turkish economy. Arguably, it may not be positioning Turkey very effectively for the future. The Kurdish problem remains. The status of women in Turkish society remains, I think, among many other significant problems that I think temper this picture of a Turkey rising. The other perspective about a rising Turkey that I like to add, and I referred back to these generational changes, this isn't just the AK Party. This has been going on for 25 or 30 years, and the policy roots go back 20, 25, 30 years. And I think that too is a perspective. This is not all about the AK Party, and I would submit that the underlying social, economic, and political issues and changes that are taking place will continue after the AKP ceases to be the party of government, whenever that may be. They're bigger and important forces going on. And I think that's a good perspective, important perspective to add to what Soner had to say. This rising Turkey, in some important ways, I think, feels itself more confident than maybe at any time in a couple of hundred years. You have to go considerably back in Ottoman times to find a country and a population that feels as confident about itself, even while recognizing many problems, even while recognizing these important political, ethnic, and other divides in the country. It feels itself more confident than in an extremely long time. And I think that, to me, is one of the main drivers for the transformation of Turkish foreign policy. The public insists on a Turkey that plays an active role in its region, that has a policy, that has a position, that plays a role, especially in the region around it, which is one of the most problematic regions of the world. To put it another way, this isn't just about the personal ambitions of Prime Minister Erdogan or Foreign Minister Davutoglu, although it is about that too. It is a much broader thing that I think has these roots in Turkish society that's important for us to bear in mind. A corollary with that is that the ambition, as Soner indicated, the ambition, the aspirations are not always entirely matched, of course, by Turkey's capabilities. And I think there has been a realization after the exuberance of the first couple of years, particularly that Ahmet Davutoglu was foreign minister, and some tacking back and greater reliance on Turkey's traditional relationships with the United States and with NATO. And that's something I want to come back to at the end. Second, U.S.-Turkish relations. Clearly, there are many problems. There are a lot of tough issues in our relationship. I would submit that U.S.-Turkish relations are better now than probably at any time ever. There are a number of people in this room that have worked on Turkey. Jim worked on Turkey going back quite a ways. Probably the closest and most intertwined relationship ever, which is not to say that it's real close or that it is greatly intertwined, but is quite a bit different from that existed before. The old relationship our countries had that was rooted in cooperation on security matters and rooted in a military-to-military relationship clearly no longer exists. It was arguably, it got a body blow in March 2003. A whole series of things, both in the region, in Turkish foreign policy, and of course domestically, have changed that. When I arrived in Turkey in 2005, our relationship was in deep difficulty. Difficulties particularly over Iraq, flowing out of the 2003 invasion, but also over Syria, Iran, issues in the Caucasus, and a whole range of other things. A relationship, looking back on it now, characterized by some combination of distrust and disregard. And I say disregard because, and this gets to the transformation of the relationship, while I was in Turkey, it was always like pulling teeth to organize a policy-based conversation among senior, but not the most senior, policy officials working on these issues around Turkey. I had to beg David Satterfield, please come Jim, you'll remember this because you were in Baghdad. Please come to Turkey. Please talk with the Turks about what we're doing. We weren't doing that, or we weren't doing it very much in the period before some point in the middle or latter part of 2006. We had to pull teeth to organize effective consultations on the problem of Iran's nuclear development plans. We had to pull teeth to arrange for a whole variety of other things. All of that has changed. The relationship now that the Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs has with her counterpart in Ankara is a close one. And you can say the same about a whole bunch of other senior mid-level officials at the State Department, the Defense Department, Treasury Department, Commerce Department, and elsewhere. And that is a gigantic change in the way that we conduct business. It owes its success, I think, to things that Jim Jeffrey and Frank Ricciardoni have done in building out a more mature and modern relationship to take advantage of the changes that have taken place in Turkey and to find something to replace that old military-to-military relationship that had been the ballast before. Looking ahead, it seems to me that as one thinks about a region where Europe and the Levant come together, and the issues that affect U.S. and transatlantic relations, that Turkey is no less important to the United States than it was 60 years ago, or 61 or 62 when Turkey joined NATO, or 66 years ago when the Truman Doctrine was first declared. It's a profoundly problematic part of the world, with most, not quite all, but most of the toughest challenges to American and Western interests. They're right around Turkey. It's not a matter of who needs who more than somebody else, but the fact is that we very much need, and I think in important ways depend upon a close relationship with Turkey, as Turkey depends on a close relationship with us for the reasons that Soner indicated. It seems to me, when it comes to policy prescriptions, that the United States, therefore, has a profound interest in keeping Turkey close to the United States and close to and deeply involved in NATO. I think that was one of the most important outcomes of the decision to deploy ballistic missile radar site in Turkey. It's a profound outcome of the decision to position Patriots in Syria. Keeping Turkey with us and with a transatlantic program, I think, is extremely important. In order to do that, I think the new Kerry, presumably Senate Welling, Kerry, and Hagel Defense Departments in particular, need to maintain very close consultations, very close dialogue with the Turks on Syria, on Iran, on Iraq, on these vital issues and problems that affect our common interests. It's a good sign that Washington is greeting this week Turkish Foreign Ministry Undersecretary Feridun Sinirlioğlu to continue that conversation, and I hope that can continue. But there's some issues and problems even in that. Whatever is the relationship at the very top, there will be a whole range of, I think, new people, particularly at the State Department. A lot of Secretary Clinton's team departs. I worry a little bit about our ability to maintain those close consultations at an extremely hot period in Syria as people change and as the normal rotation takes place. And therefore, a second point for me in terms of Washington's policies is that our top policymakers need to take actions to make sure that that mid-level dialogue on these range of tough issues continues. Third, I think, particularly when one looks at Syria, to the extent that Turkey sees effective U.S. leadership on Syria or on Iran or on Iraq, we will have fewer problems in our bilateral relationship, and we are more likely to have success, even where we disagree, as we do on some issues related to Syria, as we certainly have disagreed on issues related to Iraq and Iran. there needs to be more effective American leadership on the Syria problem in general, and I think providing that leadership will ensure that that problems and discontinuities on Syria that relate to the issues that Soner referred to, which boil down to the fact that Syria for Turkey is a vital national security issue, the biggest problem they've faced since the Cold War. We need to find ways to fill that space more effectively. A fourth point, we need to work and continue to work to find commonalities where we can. On these issues that we refer to, on a range of others, there are lots of matters where we will disagree with the authorities in Ankara. And I think where we have been more successful in our policies, in my time, in Jim's time, and under other ambassadors, it's where we've found ways to work on the common pieces that we share, and in a way that can get the problem into a different place. Again, it's a matter of showing the right kind of American leadership. Final point, I think we need to work to try to build out the economic and trade space in our relationship, always a relatively impoverished part of U.S.-Turkish relations. As the United States thinks about a possible free trade agreement with the European Union, we will need to take into account those countries that enjoy a customs union with the EU, Norway, I think it's Norway, Switzerland, and Turkey. And so there's a piece there that I think the United States ought to be able to make use of in the next administration, policy piece to build out and strengthen the trade and economic exchange framework between our two countries. And I think that is also a piece that I hope the next administration works on. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim?
As Soner and Ross have said most everything I wanted to say better than I would say it, I'll be brief, but just a couple of points. First of all, as Ross said, and I agree completely, much of what we see with the AKP and the Turkey of today traced its roots back to Turgut Özal, who in his own era for almost a decade, or roughly a decade, as Prime Minister and President, also dominated Turkish politics and also had that combination of Islamic roots in the National Salvation Party of Erbakan, very strong support for economic outreach and development and support for the business sector, and close ties to the West, which, despite problems I think that we still have with Prime Minister Erdogan. So there is some continuity. I would also say that there is some continuity in the Middle East as well, and I'll get to this in a second because that's what I want to focus on in a couple of minutes here, is the Middle East and Turkey as a new potential regional power and how it all fits together. The conventional wisdom is that Turkey discovered the Middle East one day when then academician and foreign policy advisor Ahmet Davutoğlu woke up and said, we need to have a Middle Eastern policy. Yeah, there's something to the south of us. That's not actually correct, although he played a very, very important role along with President Gül and Prime Minister Erdogan in where Turkey is today. First of all, Turkey has always had very strong interests in the Middle East, particularly in the narrow broad of Turkey to the south. These interests can be summed up with two words: security and petroleum. And I would say that much of the Turkish focus in the Middle East remains in that area today. Turkey in the 1980s and 1990s developed a very strong commercial petroleum relationship with Iran, importing eventually about 40% of its, or a significant part of its petroleum from Iran, and a significant amount of natural gas, next only to Russia, also from Iran, and building pipelines to ensure that the gas could flow into the Turkish net. Likewise with Iraq in the 1980s, the that was another pipeline, remember? The Kirkuk-Ceyhan pipeline, they all wind up in Ceyhan, had a capacity that was reached in the 1980s of 1.6 million barrels. That's a lot of oil that was being pumped out of Iraq through Turkey. Security, at one or another point, Turkey had very strong relations, plus or minus, negative or positive, including negative with Iraq, particularly northern Iraq, incursions, large-scale military operations in the 1990s in northern Iraq against the PKK, likewise mobilizing the bulk of Turkey's army in the late 1990s to drive Öcalan out of Damascus, and continued strains not only over the PKK but over other issues with Iran back and forth for 20 years. So these have been present for some time. Turkey's relationship with Israel, which right now is in the fridge but was very strong beginning in the 1980s, to some degree was an effort to try to balance some of the problems on its near abroad south. So that's been around for quite some time. Now, the new Turkey, we're looking at from the prism of a regional power. Let me talk just a second about regional powers. Regional powers are kind of hard to define and explain and figure out how to use, partially because those of us who've actually tried to be on the operating end of the U.S. government and its global power know how hard being a global power is. Well, I can imagine being a regional power is even harder because we haven't had a lot of success, nor have regional powers had a lot of success actually being regional powers. At one or another, but America keeps looking for regional powers because, frankly, as all of you who are Americans in the room know, we're kind of conflicted about being the single, unilateral, omnipresent, irreplaceable world power. And as those of you who aren't Americans in the room know, most of the rest of the world is a little uncomfortable about a country that has as much power as we do, regardless of how well, and I think we do use it well, how well we use it. So this idea of regional power is kind of helping us out, lifting some of the burden, or getting us out of the neighborhood is a reoccurring theme. In our past, we've looked at the UK, we've looked at Germany, we've looked at Japan, we've looked at the Shah of Iran, we've looked at Saudi Arabia, Egypt under Sadat and Mubarak in the early days, and Israel as a possible regional power that we can leverage and deploy and such. These days, there are new regional powers that are out there. China in the Far East, Russia to some degree in its near abroad, Turkey we talk about in the Middle East, South Africa in Africa, and Brazil in South America. But when we actually peel back the onion, there isn't a whole lot there. Take a look at the most powerful in the country with the best claim to being a regional superpower, and that's China. Far larger economy than the rest of, well, not far larger economy if you throw in Japan and Korea, but certainly the largest economy and probably more than half of the total GDP of the whole region, by far the strongest military power in the region. Yet China has all kinds of problems just dealing with some rocks in the South China Sea, with upstart countries challenging them. Now, in the end, we don't know how this is all going to turn out. It may not turn out well for anybody, but the point is China has a lot of problems leveraging that regional power, and I would say that that's the way it is around the world. It's not easy being a regional power, as Milosevic found out in the Balkans in the 1990s. You run into a lot of opposition, and a lot of the opposition turns to us, the Americans, and says, hey, we don't want to be dominated by a regional power. That's part of our issue with Iran today. So Turkey is still trying to work out how to be a regional power given its extraordinary economic development, but given the fact that that economic development largely doesn't flow into or from the Middle East. The Middle East provides roughly 20 to 25% of Turkey's imports and exports, with much of the trade being in, the imports at least being petroleum. And then Turkey, of course, is a member of non-Middle Eastern clubs that give it a lot of leverage, the EU, NATO, even OECD. The primary establishment international organization, we have a representative of it here today, is the Arab League in the Middle East, and Turkey, of course, is not a member. And there is a whole set of ideologies and other issues that can limit Turkey's influence. That said, it is in many respects one of the 2 or 3 most important countries in the Middle East, and its importance will continue to grow. But its basic area of focus is going to be to its immediate south and southeast with Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And there we have a lot of work to do with Turkey and to cooperate with them, first of all on Iraq, the future of Iraq, the question of the Kurdish North, what about the petroleum and other resources of the North. Turkey is extremely powerful in terms of its commercial and energy relations with Kurdistan. How is that all going to evolve? By the same token, we've talked about Syria. Syria is an area where I think there's a lot of agreement, certainly in this institution and around this city, that the United States has to get more involved. But what exactly does that mean? And where do we have commonalities with Turkey? Where do we not? What kind of a Syria do we want? What kind of a Syria does Turkey want? I would disagree with Ross. I think that this is the most energetic crisis Turkey has faced since the Cold War, being Syria. But Syria's ability to impact Turkey in the long run, other than some impact on the PKK issue, is relatively limited. It's just that if Turkey wants to expand its influence and authority in the region, which is something that I think the United States finds a good thing, all things being taken together, then it has to be on the winning side on Syria. And right now, the Syrian question, frankly, is the thing that is the biggest question mark of the several involving Iranian nuclear issues, the whole future of Iraq and the Kurdish North, and Syria. So those are the areas where we focus with Turkey, rather than trying to look at whether it's cultural and soft power and potential hard power will be able to lead it to a dominant role in the Middle East with major players such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, and Iran. Let's focus on Turkey's immediate south and how we can cooperate best there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, ambassadors and Sonair. A lot of very interesting ideas, provocative analysis. I'm going to turn now to open up a discussion with you and our panelists on the direction of U.S.-Turkish relations. I'm going to first pose a question and then turn it over to Sonair to pursue the rest of the Q&A. I apologize, I need to depart. Sonair, you outlined a scenario where, as I heard it, the two most important variables, in your view, for determining a sort of continued positive trajectory for this this evolution that you described were, one, persistent economic growth at home, and two, keeping the Syria problem on the other side of the border. I hope I'm not being too telegraphic, but that's what I heard. I didn't hear you address what happens if one or both of these doesn't happen. I mean, we won't be Turkey would not be the first country to have considerable economic growth go bust. Point one. And Turkey would not be the first country to have a real foreign policy mess on the other side of its border make its way over the barricades. What would happen to this Turkey rising model if one or the other happens, and what happens if both happens? Sonair.
Thank you, Rob, and I also wanted to thank both my friends Ambassador Wilson and Jeffrey for joining me today. Our two most recent envoys in Ankara. I'm pleased and delighted you can join me for this conversation. To go to your question, you're right. I think those are the two, what I would call independent variables of the new Turkey. Economic growth and keeping Syria mess out of Turkey. If they can do that, Turkey will rise, continue to rise, and build more power. And at the same time, I think there are some dependent variables that are linked to what could go wrong in Syria, or if there's an economic bust. In some ways, the Turkish economic growth is continuing predominantly because the country attracts a lot of hot money into the Istanbul stock market, and secondly, because it attracts a lot of money from its neighborhood, actual cash coming in. People who feel that they don't want to keep their money in Syria, or metal billionaires in Ukraine, Central Asian republics, North Africa, the country's Balkan and Southern European neighbors are putting their money in Turkey because that's a safe haven. It looks stable. So Turkey is Turkey. It's in a way, without indulging too much in Schadenfreude, Turkey's luck is that it sits in an unlucky region. To the west and to the east, the economic problems of Southern Europe and political problems of the Arab Spring has made Turkey much of a better example to sell to the international markets than it would have otherwise been, and that's why they have to remain economically, politically stable at home and externally at whatever cost, because that's what keeps the economy growing. That's what brings about a few $1 billion of Syrian cash into one province, just the Hatay province along the coast where Antioch is, Bank deposits are increasing by about a couple of $1 billion every year, and that province's economy is only about $15 billion. So it's not their money. It's cash that comes across the border, and you can just imagine money flowing in. That, I think, it really is a big driver. So their luck is that they sit in an unlucky region. I think the government is aware of that. If the economy tanks, or if Turkey gets involved in Syria conflict, or the mess in Syria spills over across into Turkey, that means a couple of things. The end of this run for miraculous economic growth, obviously the two are interrelated. You could also see how if Syria gets out of control, this could have ramifications in Turkey in terms of PKK violence, or if Turkey is not able to pacify the PKK through these ongoing peace talks before the end of the Assad regime. If you have the organization establishing safe havens in Syria because the peace talks have collapsed, that's another headache that Turkey has to deal with. It will actually be an insurgency that Turkey will have to deal with next door. If you look at a map that shows Syrian cities under control of PYD, the PKK Syrian franchise, every town from Hatay all the way east to the Turkish-Iraqi-Syrian border triangular area, known as Kenardebek, all that area, every little town across the border is under control of PYD. So this is Turkey's challenge, and I think that's going to be compounding if Turkey cannot keep Syria out. Secondly, it will disappoint Erdogan's desires or plans or ambitions to become Turkey's next president through a popular vote. Turkey just changed the constitution recently so that the next president will be elected through a popular vote. This will be the first time a president elected through a popular vote. I think that's Erdogan's dream, to be the next president, to get to Ataturk's position after having moved Turkey into a post-Kemalist phase and take over his seat through a popular vote, and that requires, again, continued economic stability, growth, and keeping Syria out. That, I think, means that they'll come to the U.S. more in the coming year for action on Syria, and I think Ross mentioned this. Syria is going to be a stress test of Turkish-U.S. relationship in the coming year. Everything good we have highlighted about cooperation. Increasingly, if Turkey will need the U.S. more and more to keep Syria mess outside of Turkey, to make sure that Assad's departure is accelerated, because the more he stays there, the more the problem comes to Turkey, the more Turkey looks like it's a country that sits next to an imploding country. That's not where you want to put your money in. It again comes to economic growth. And I think those two variables, dependent variables, are to a large extent going to determine PKK violence, the plans for it, electoral victories for Erdogan's ambitions to become a president. There are many ways, therefore, as you highlight, that all this could not go well, Turkey, if Turkey does not play its hand well. And I think play its hand well to a large extent, both domestic politics-wise and also regional ambitions-wise, depends on Syria. This is, for the U.S., Syria is an important policy issue. It's something we need to address. For the Turks, it has to be done now. Assad's departure has to be this year. The longer he stays, the more this country fractures along ethnic lines, and the conflict will spill over into Turkey. I think that will become a problem that they can't live with. So we'll see a lot of, I think that's what I mean when I say stress test. We'll see a lot of requests and demands from Turkey for Washington to take the leadership. And that will be interesting to see to what extent the relationship between President Obama and Prime Minister Erdogan that we saw build in the last few years will persist through that stress test that's coming through.
Sorry, you want to take over?
Thank you, Rob, and I'm going to open the floor now to questions. I'll recognize you in the order that I'm seeing. We have a mic coming up, or? Yes, sir. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6.
Thank you, Mr.
Is it on? Okay, it's on.
Hello? Yeah. Okay. This is Mohammed Al-Husseini. I'm the ambassador of the Arab League here. Just regarding the, how serious do you think are the USA and European countries regarding dealing with the PKK? As you know, the European countries and the United States consider the PKK as a terrorist organization or movement, whatever. This is one. The other one is regarding the zero problem. You know, you remember the book, of course, written by Ahmed Dawoodoglu, the current foreign minister, regarding it's the title, The Strategic Depth, regarding the zero problem, and the focus of the book on the zero problems now. And he was successful before the Arab Spring in solving many problems with their neighbors. Now, after the Arab Spring, the zero problem is not there anymore. It's not valid anymore. Now Turkey has many problems. It's not anymore zero problems. What is the effects of the Arab Spring on the economic relationship with Turkey? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thanks for coming. I think Turkey had more support from the U.S. against the PKK than it had from any of its friends. The United States obviously listed PKK as a terrorist group before any other country did, has provided Turkey with significant support. You know, this was reported in the media. Öcalan, the leader of PKK, was caught with U.S. assistance. The U.S. has provided Turkey with military assistance and hardware to fight the PKK. And I think without U.S. support, also to mobilize European countries to both list the PKK as a terrorist group, Turkey would not be here today in terms of the distance it has covered in its fight against the PKK. Zero problems policy, obviously, I think worked so long as there was no Arab Spring. I think this was a policy which was designed on the idea that Turkey could have good ties with its neighbors, regardless of who was in charge in Damascus or Tehran, because what mattered was building good commercial relations, which would be a segue, good political ties. And I think that policy has been exposed in many places to be not working, because the Arab Spring has meant that Iran and Turkey perhaps are not good friends, as Ankara wanted the two countries to become. There is a war, in my view, today taking place in Syria, and it's a war of proxies. Turkey is supporting and arming and hosting elements of it, according to the media, the opposition, and the Assad, Tehran is arming the government. So these, you know, the degree of separation between Turkish and Iranian positions in Syria is basically direct. They're in opposing camps, and I think that means long-term competition between the two countries, even after the Assad regime goes. Given that Syria is not going to be a walk in the park. Finally, I think Iraq is another area where you're going to see tensions between the two countries, as Turkey, does not get along well with the Maliki government, and who seems to be on good terms with the Iranians. But I think the Arab Spring has also shown Turkey a challenge. So I'll explain to you, for instance, in terms of economic growth. Turkey is growing well because it is exporting. First, it has diversified. It's dealing with non-European markets. So it has weathered the downturn of the European markets really well. But secondly, it's also growing because although Europe is still Turkey's most dominant trade partner, EU accounts for about half of Turkey's trade, down from 2/3 about a decade ago. The share of Arab Middle East in Turkey's trade has gone up significantly, and the broader Middle East about a 20%, 25% now. But guess what? Turkish-Iraqi ties have largely collapsed, so Turkish trucks cannot now go through Iraq to sell their wares. There's an unofficial ban against that. Turkish-Syrian trade has collapsed, so Turkish trucks cannot go through Syria. Turkey basically has no land contact with its broader Arab neighborhood to the south now. It has lost it, and I think the Arab Spring is therefore an issue where it's not just the political ramifications of the Syrian uprising, but it's the fact that it actually it's cutting into Turkey's very ability to maintain those valuable trade links and commercial links. Doug?
Doug Fife from the Hudson Institute. Soner, you emphasize the importance of liberal democratic provisions in the Constitution that's being worked on. And there are grounds for concern about actual and potential tensions between the Islamist philosophy of the Erdogan government and basic principles of democracy. You have more journalists, as I understand it, in Turkey imprisoned than in any other country in the world. You have hundreds of general officers and flag officers imprisoned, many of them without charge. Enormous increase in the murder rate against women. I mean, a number of things that are very troubling from the point of view of the future of Turkish democracy. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Thank you. Look, the new Turkey that has emerged, I would say, is an amalgam of the old Turkey and the AKP's vision. It is a bit of both, but it's not predominantly one or the other. And I would say, if you ask me, you said, so what is the gist of your new Turkey argument? You've talked about post-Kemalism and economic transformation and societal splits and soft power. Describe to me in one sentence what this new Turkey is. I would say, and these are not overlapping or exclusive constituencies, I would say the new Turkey is a bit secularist, I'm not saying secular, a bit Islamist, I'm not saying Muslim, a bit conservative, a bit liberal, a bit Western, and a bit Middle Eastern, and a bit European. And that's not the old Turkey, but it's the new Turkey, and I think that is the reason why all these disparate parts need to find a way to live with each other, because there are at least 10, 20 million people each. And you can't just wish them away. They won't go away. They won't disappear. Let me take two. The two extremes of the political spectrum. I would say I was born and raised in Turkey, but having observed it, but also studying it for years and looking at election results. About 10 to 15% of Turks are secularists who want to see no religion whatsoever in public life, and about 10 to 15% are Islamists who probably would like to see Sharia law in place. Those are the two extremes. 10 million each. They're not going to go away. Even if you wanted them to go away, and then everybody else falls in between. You know, you have everything from the conservative right to the liberal left, and as I said earlier, these are not necessarily exclusive categories. I think the beauty of New Turkey is that these constituencies are all equally large, and in some case comparatively large, that one cannot just close their eyes and say, oh, tomorrow I'll wake up and this one will go away. And I think that's the reason why there has to be some kind of a new, even if it's not an entirely new constitution, the new Turkey will, if it wants to rise as a regional power, have to find room for everyone. I think that's where the debate on the constitution comes in, because it's the only way you can guarantee that. Yes, sir, there's a question. Please identify yourselves also. Oh, did you want to weigh in, Jim? Ross? Yeah, I would like to take some questions for also my colleagues. Sorry,
Paul Berger at Arnold and Porter. To what extent does the apparent particular Islamist attitude of Erdogan in foreign policy affect, if at all, his reliability for the United States and NATO? And I'm talking about his attitude as it relates to Sudan, or his total positive attitude toward Hamas, and to a certain extent Hezbollah. To what extent, if at all, does that affect Turkey's reliability on international issues that we, the United States and NATO, face and have to deal with Turkey?
Jim, do you want to win?
Sure.
I think you have to come up here for the program to be recorded.
Very quickly, I don't think that's a major issue in NATO for the moment. Right now, NATO has evolved since the 1990s into basically an out-of-area expeditionary force that projects stability and essentially, to some degree, UN resolutions through force. That's what we did in the Balkans with NATO. That's what happened in Libya. And that's what's been happening since 2003, 2004 in Afghanistan. Turkey has played a big role in all of those. I think it will continue playing a big role because it's in Turkey's interest to ally with its NATO neighbors and NATO allies to work together under the cover of NATO for goals that Turkey finds compatible. I think that those of us who've dealt on the ground with Turkey, be it on the missile defense issue, be it on Afghanistan and its troop presence and other things, there are a lot of detailed issues where Turkey raises questions. The issue of the NATO radar plugging into the Israeli air defense system is one such example. The rules of engagement for Turkish forces in Afghanistan being another. But we work through these because Turkey is a major player in NATO. It provides a lot of clout. It provides a lot of troops when it does decide to take action. And so I think that it's worked out so far. In the future, there are issues that might come up. But my feeling is that you have to get not just an American consensus, which is not hard, which is not easy, as we can see right now with Syria. You have to get a consensus within most of NATO to take action in country X, because that's what NATO is all about now, is basically projecting power, not defending itself. And that general consensus within NATO is sufficiently broad that typically Turkey would find itself within it. I don't see Turkey being a blocking power in NATO. We've come close to that a couple of times in the past, but we've been able to work through it. But it's something to watch.
Carol, you've been waiting, so please wait for the mic.
If I understood you correctly, Sonia, you suggested that if Turkey wants...
Is it on?
If you suggested that if Turkey wants to be a regional power, it has, among other things, it should show that it can reach out to all elements of the Syrian opposition. You suggested that Turkey has to reach out to all elements of the Syrian opposition, regardless of sex or ethnicity. He also suggested that it should figure out a way to talk to Israel again. He also suggested that Turkey needs to find a way to develop a liberal constitution, liberal democratic constitution, to reach out to all elements within Turkey.
I think the driver, the question was about, what concrete evidence do I see that this more positive scenario that I highlighted could be happening. Obviously, there are factors beyond our control, global economic downturn, one of Turkey's major trading partners goes into a bust and Turkey suffers from that, or, collapse of the financial markets that goes through Istanbul. That could take out all of these variables and just by itself basically debilitate Turkey's effort to rise as a regional power. But beyond that, the evidence that I'm seeing is it's not whether Prime Minister Erdogan loves the United States or loves the fact that Turkey is NATO. It's the fact that he has realized that Turkey really needs NATO. And therefore, hold on, that's the reason I think he's realizing, number one, this is a country that cannot do the Middle East on its own. Number two, this is a country that, though it had a collapse of its ties with Israel, has to maintain a relationship. That's why I highlighted the fact that it was the Turkish prime minister who leaked to the media that Turkey is in secret talks with the Israelis for normalization. Okay, the foreign minister says Turkey is in secret talks. They're not secret anymore. So obviously he's making a point by saying that Turkey wants to be a regional power that can talk to everybody, and that it is working on that. On the domestic politics side, I am less optimistic. I think if you asked me, you said, of the two, which one would you pick? Turkey's pivot to the United States and NATO, or a liberal democratic constitution? I would pick Turkey's pivot to the United States and NATO over a liberal democratic constitution, because I think that is driven less by hard facts and more by, let's say, less by hard facts than the pivot, which is really driven by instability in Syria, competition against Iran, Erdogan's desire to be elected as president. He cannot afford to have the Syria conflict spill into Turkey, period. And he'll do everything he can to get the U.S. and NATO work with him to contain that crisis over there, make sure Assad goes as soon as possible, and all of that requires him to reach out to the U.S. and work closely with the U.S. and with NATO. On the domestic front, I think the issue is less burning because he has built a significant amount of support, popular, and if the elections of 2013, local nationwide elections coming up this year, if they turn out to be a major AKP victory, if he goes over 50%, maybe 55, 60, he'll be less inclined to accommodate these disparate halves of the country because he's going to come out thinking that he has such solid support, as any politician would. Why would they care to accommodate the views of the other side? If, on the other hand, the election results are one in which you see, and again, a very split Turkey, that could, again, once again, move him towards a more compromising attitude. But as I said, Turkey is, in my view, if it was a vegetable, it would be an onion. It never has a core. There's always a peel. You take you think you got to the essence of it. It's not there. There's always one peel after the other. So I don't think it's, even on the liberal democracy side, I would say it's too early to rule out that emerging. I can see, as I said, why that would come up. The advanced copy of this study, which you're going to receive at the end of the panel, and I wanted to thank my research staff, Tyler Evans and SNFF, for helping me with this and with my forthcoming book. This is, parts of it are driven from the book, obviously. Its cover is, you'll recognize this, a lot of you in the room are Turkey specialists. This is the signature of an Ottoman Sultan. This is Mahmud II. I was asked to pick an image, and I went through a lot, and I said, that kind of fits, because to make a point that Turkey's westernization and institutional westernization is not a Kemalist story. It goes beyond him. This is the first Ottoman Sultan who started Turkey's westernization, and Ataturk built on his legacy, obviously. He was born out of schools that he established, the Sultan had established, or his successors had, to make a point that this country's connections, deep-rooted connections to the West are not ephemeral. They're not a product of the last few years or of the Cold War. They go very deep. And I think these are the institutional bonds that will keep Turkey anchored to the West. Both of the ambassadors here join me, I think, in seconding that thought. Turkey's membership to NATO, which is so serious and so deep-rooted and so accepted across the society that the recent deployment of Dutch, German, and American Patriot missiles in Turkey took place without a single doubt, without a debate. Everybody was like, of course. It was not a question of if and shall we, it was a question of when and how. And I think that's the kind of bond that I talk about that eventually puts the new Turkey into an amalgam of what it was, but also into a place that it will always continue to have really deep-rooted ties to the West. So I think the pivot, therefore, is real, it stays, and it will only become stronger as Syria problem is not going to go away. Though obviously, I think the speed at which the United States is ready to willing to take action and lead the international community, and the speed at which Ankara expects action, that's going to create tensions in the relationship. Jim, did you want to weigh in? Russ? Question waiting here, and then Ariel in the front, and then third in the back. Okay. So maybe we'll take all three at the same time to wrap up.
How has the rest of the non-arrested military reacted to the fact that so many of their senior colleagues were jailed? And what are they saying among themselves privately about how they feel about this situation? Okay. And what are the portents for the future in the event that the economy does take a dive and that the current government becomes less popular?
Thank you. It's a question in the front here and the question in the back.
Good afternoon. Ariel Cohen, the Heritage Foundation. We talked about relations with a number of Turkey's neighbors. We did not talk about the Turkish backyard in the Caucasus. And as Soner aptly pointed out, that the war in Syria is a proxy war, and I agree. It is also a proxy war with another power that supports the Assad regime, and that's Russia. Russia and Turkey had somewhat of a honey decade or 2 decades with economic cooperation, tourism, etc. But now with the landing of a forced landing of a Russian airplane that was carrying spare parts to Syria and a postponement of the Putin visit, the relationship is kind of rocky. The other important aspect of that is Russian support of Armenia and Turkish support of Azerbaijan. How do you see the future of Turkish relationships in the South Caucasus and the evolution of, I want to say 500 years old, but maybe 500 years old, Turkish, Ottoman, Russian relationship? Thank you.
And one final question in the back, yeah.
Hillel Fratkin of the Hudson Institute. First, I wanted to thank Soner and his colleagues for this discussion. It was really very interesting and impressive, but there was something, it seemed very puzzling to me about it, and that was the relative absence of the name of Erdogan throughout it. This is a story of rising Turkey, but that story seems intimately connected with rising Erdogan. And for all the continuities from the past and so forth, it does really seem that the kind of success you talked about over the past decade, Erdogan was the architect of it. So one question is, how much does all of this depend on Erdogan? And secondarily, or related to that, how much does this depend on his capacity for good sense? And this relates to this question of how the Syria problem will work itself out or won't. It seemed, in terms of the U.S.-Turkish relationship, we now seem to have gotten to a point where the relationship of the U.S. and Turkey is like the famous example of Alphonse and Gaston. Originally, Erdogan wanted to take the lead on these things, and our government said, go ahead. That was back in March 2011. Now and there were very pronounced utterances along those lines by Secretary of State Clinton. Now, as you say, Soner, the situation looks less doable by Turkey itself. And there's, discontent with having to do it by itself. But we're now at this situation where each is deferring, so to speak, in a way, to the other. So who's actually going to take the lead here, and what would that mean? Thank you.
I was trying to get away, but I did not succeed. All right.
I did address it to your
all right. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Look, I think just as Turkey has realized that it really needs NATO and the United States to minimize the fallout of Syria conflict and to finish it off, or whatever, bring forth the end of the Assad regime, finish it off, maybe is not the right word. To the extent that Turkey has realized that it needs both us and NATO to get there, it's also realized one more thing, and that's kind of the other aspect of the pivot. Turkey is, just as it is, institutional westernization is too deep for it to just rip it off. It can't, because it's both valuable, meaningful, and common Turks can relate to that westernization story. Nobody in Turkey dislikes NATO, basically. Everybody likes NATO because NATO protected Turkey against communism or godless communism, whichever way you look at it. And it has been, a protector of Turkish security against many other crises. At the same time, the country's links to OECD. Again, one of my friends here mentioned it. This is not something that the Turks simply can say, oh, we'll go at it on our own because we don't like the society of this club. This country is too much part of a global economy, for example, to let things veer off. So when it comes to its deep-rooted relationship with the global economy, but also with Western institutions, I think it doesn't matter who's in charge in Ankara. Everybody comes to appreciate that this is something Turkey has to cherish because this is what makes Turkey powerful, and it's also what will make Turkey a regional power if it can continue to grow. So I'll give you an example. How globalization shapes the new Turkey. Turkish-Israeli ties suffer from a major turndown. We all know that the countries don't have diplomatic ambassadorial representation in each other's capitals. Ties are frozen. Yet Turkish-Israeli economic relationship is booming. Trade has increased at a 30% pace since the flotilla incident, at a higher rate of increase than it did in the heyday of the relationship in the 1990s. So they're trading. Yeah. From 2010 to 2011, 30% rate. It's increasing at a higher pace than it did in the earlier years. First, because the two countries have kept, now, they don't have diplomatic relationship, their ties are supposedly frozen. They have a free trade agreement in place, functioning and running. So that kind of shows you that economically, Turkey is realizing that these relations, there is an element of the new Turkey that's also a legacy of the old Turkey. On the question on the military, I think this is a debate that has been largely resolved. I think the military has resigned to the power of the civilian authority, and that's not probably going to change for the foreseeable future. On Russia, good question. I think and question on Erdogan, the two will relate. You'll see Prime Minister Erdogan lash out to pretty much any power, any country. If he doesn't like somebody's behavior, he'll make a public point. He'll say it very loudly, very publicly. He's probably bashed every neighboring country of Turkey. He will never do that with the Russians. If you can find one comment where Erdogan will come out and publicly blame Russia for its Syria policy. No, Turkey's policy on Russia is deeply ingrained in Turkish psyche on Russia. Russia is Turkey's only neighbor that Turkey is scared of, I would say. Everybody else Turkey can live with or feels it's in a power parity. Iranians, they think of themselves as having established this parity back in the 17th century. The Safavids versus the Ottomans. They decided not to fight ever again, and that was the deal since 1630s, and they have not fought. Many other powers, neighbors, Turkey does not feel concerned. They're too small. With the exception of Iran and Russia, both energy-rich economies, so exceptions as well, all of Turkey's other neighbors are such small economies compared to Turkey that you could fit all of them into Istanbul and there will be room to throw in one more country. This is how Turks view their world, but Russia is huge. And it's the historic enemy. I think this is deeply ingrained in everybody's psyche. Ever since the Ottomans and the Russians established land border in 1490s, they fought 19 campaigns. And in all of these campaigns, the Ottomans lost. And I think, therefore, the Turkish perception of Russia is not going to be one where they'll be pushing that around. I think Erdogan, being a typical Turk, is reflective of that. Now I'll turn to my colleagues for finishing comments, and we'll wrap it up.
Yes. The Caucasus was made for you.
Was it? No, not directly. Your question about how much depends on Erdogan and how much depends on his capacity for good sense or reason. A lot depends on Erdogan. The AK Party is a coalition that he and Abdullah Gül and a few others stitched together. The glue that holds the coalition together is Tayyip Erdogan. It is a big question whether any other AK Party leader can keep that coalition together, or whether its constituent parts, its more Islamist part, its more conservative nationalist part, its more Western-oriented parts might spin off in other directions. And so I think a great deal depends on him. Second, Erdogan is a pragmatist. I think that's one of the most important traits of his political career. He sometimes says very sharp things, but at the end of the day, the policies usually end up being viewed through a very pragmatic prism. And therefore, I think the policy challenge for the United States is, what are the actions, what's the kind of relationship the United States can pursue that it will be more likely to keep Turkish policy more in the good sense category as opposed to mischievous or difficult or problematic ones for us. Question about the economy. I think a significant share of the AK Party's political success owes to Turkey's economic success over the last number of years. The core ideological, although the term is not the right one for this purpose, but the core base of supporters of the party is probably closer to a third of the Turkish population. They get the additional votes because people are happy with their way of life. They are happy with the prosperity that's come to the country, and they are happy with the relative stability, political stability that the AK Party has brought about. And I think if the economy goes south, they're going to head back down to that natural base of supporters, and then the environment will be more competitive for the other parties if they can figure out how to develop a 21st century message, which by and large they've not succeeded so far in doing. The Caucasus, I think the main issue in the Caucasus that the Turks work successfully is energy, and you can see that now in the gas diplomacy. Otherwise, my own personal view is that the Caucasus is not a priority for Turkey. It is especially not a priority right now, given all the difficulties in Syria and to some extent Iraq and Iran. And Turkey's relationship in the region is quite significantly limited, or its ability to play in the region is quite significantly limited by the fact it doesn't have a relationship with one of the three countries. It was changing that paradigm that was one of the issues that impelled the Turkish government to pursue a normalization strategy with Armenia. And I would submit eventually it will be the one that pulls Turkey back into a more activist role in the Caucasus at some point in the future. We'll leave it at that.
Very quickly, to go back to the Syria thing, because I may have downplayed it too much by saying that it's not an existential issue for Turkey. It is a very important one. First, why isn't it existential like, as we just heard, Russia is? Because, first of all, Syria, no matter who's in charge, is really not going to pose a serious conventional or even unconventional military threat against Turkey. Turkey, the economic ties were quite low despite all of the hype a few years ago, and they're almost non-existent now, and Turkey's doing quite fine without it. We talk about the refugees, but frankly, two much smaller and economically weaker and much less politically stable states, Syria and Jordan, took about 10 times that many Iraqi refugees about 7-8 years ago, and they didn't tank. So Turkey can handle 100, 200,000 refugees if it has to. It doesn't want to, but this isn't a threat to the stability of the state. What is under question here, and it's very, very important, is the ability of Turkey, along with the Gulf states led by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and the United States, to basically manage the stability and war and peace issues of the Middle East focused on Syria. If Syria flips and we get rid of the Assad regime, generally, on a very rough scale, the threat that Iran poses in the region by its Mediterranean outreach through Lebanon and Hezbollah and against Israel drops significantly, the threat to the region from radical Sunni Islamic groups rises. Now, in balancing the two, it's obvious that Turkey thinks it can handle the Sunni terrorist threat, and I think it's right, and that there's a lot to be gained by knocking out this one leg of Iran's expansionist policies. That's where I would be. I'm not sure that that same calculus is being measured the same way by everybody in the Obama administration. So this is something that the debate is going on in Washington right now. But there can be no question that the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar and other countries have laid down a line in the sand saying Assad has to go. Well, he's not going. Despite the military successes of the rebels recently, there's no guarantee that this guy is going to go this year, as you said, Sona. And so what's going to happen then? This will be a huge blow for us and the Turks and other people in the Middle East. It will be a huge blow for stability. And frankly, it will be a huge win not only for Assad, who will hang on somehow. He's not going to own much of his country, but he might hang on. But more importantly, for Iran and for an activist Russian foreign policy in the region. This spells bad news for us and for Turkey. Turkey's right to be insisting that we do more. Thank you.